Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. You guys have sent us some really fascinating material for this deep dive. We've got a whole stack of sources about how religious education and missions work kind of go hand in hand. And, it's really got us thinking beyond just that first step, right?
Right.
Of sharing your faith. Like, what happens after that?
Yeah.
How do we really equip new believers with the tools and knowledge they need to thrive?
Yeah. That follow-up, it's so crucial.
It is, yeah. And so our mission, if you will, in this deep dive is to really understand exactly how religious education fits into that broader mission. And then to kind of pull out those key principles that make it truly effective.
Yeah, I think what's striking to me, looking at all this material, is this inherent tension, right? You've got this, two-part journey in what we often call, the Great Commission. It's not just about that initial sharing, the proclamation of the message, but then what? What happens next? It's this crucial follow-up, like you were saying, of teaching, discipling, empowering those new believers to really grow and mature in their faith. It's like, planting a seed and then carefully cultivating its growth, providing the right conditions for it to flourish. And religious education plays a huge role in that.
It does. It really does. One thing that jumped out at me right away is this idea that we spend so much time unpacking the theological why behind mission work, the reasons we do it, but the actual philosophy of religious education, the nuts and bolts of teaching and learning in these settings, I feel like it sometimes gets less attention. So help me understand this why. Is having a clear philosophy so essential, especially when we're talking about missions in a cross-cultural context?
Well, if we take a step back for a moment and think about it in broader terms, I think philosophy in this context, and as one of the sources beautifully puts it, it's love of wisdom. It provides this foundational framework, like a blueprint. It brings clarity to areas that might feel uncertain or maybe even a little overwhelming, especially when you're stepping into a new culture. It's about identifying those overarching principles, those guiding lights that will shape our approach. Without that compass, our efforts to teach and equip new believers in a missions context could become, a bit haphazard. We could end up working at cross purposes, or even worse, unintentionally undermine the very goals we're striving for.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's about intentionality and having that clear direction from the outset.
Absolutely. It's about approaching this vital task with wisdom and forethought.
Okay, so let's unpack this philosophy a bit further. The material you shared lays out 5 core areas that this philosophy of religious education considers. The first one is the teacher. Now, it talks about God being the ultimate teacher and the role of the Holy Spirit. But for the person on the ground, the human teacher in a mission setting, what does that actually look like in practice?
This point about God being the ultimate teacher and the Holy Spirit working through us, it raises a really important consideration about the teacher as a role model, as an example. The sources really emphasize that the teacher's character has a huge influence on those they're teaching.
Absolutely.
So, they are, first and foremost, a disciple themselves. Their life should reflect the teachings, And of course, there's the practical aspect of being well prepared, knowing your material, all that good stuff. But one thing that stood out to me is the idea that the teachers should really be intentional about building relationships with their students, to see those relationships as a conduit, a way the Holy Spirit can work. It's more than just imparting information. It's about creating an environment or a relational space where spiritual formation can really take root.
I see. So it's about being an example, not just an instructor.
Exactly. Walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Right. Okay. So that's the teacher. What about the learner? How does this philosophy view the person we're trying to reach and teach in a missions context?
Well, one of the things I found really insightful here is the way the learner is framed. They're not seen as an adversary, as someone you need to, intellectually conquer or debate into submission. Instead, the learner is understood as someone created by God, bearing God's image, and possessing incredible potential for meaningful relationships with God, with others, and with the world around them. So the goal shifts, right? It's not about overcoming an opponent. It's about enabling and equipping the learner to live a life of purpose and walk in relationship with God. It's a much more empowering perspective, I think.
It is. It's about recognizing their inherent worth and potential.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got the teacher, the learner. Now, when we talk about methodology, like how we actually go about teaching in these settings, what are some of the key philosophical ideas that we should keep in mind?
One of the sources makes this crucial point that no single teaching method is like this silver bullet that's going to magically work in every situation, right? You can't just take a cookie cutter approach. The methods we choose should be directly tied to the spiritual aims we're trying to achieve. And ultimately, the goal isn't just to fill people's heads with facts and figures. It's to help them become the people God intends them to be.
Yeah.
To foster genuine transformation, not just, the transfer of information.
Right. So the how has to serve the why.
Exactly. It's about aligning our methods with our ultimate goals.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, curriculum. It's probably not a big surprise that the Bible is identified as the central source here.
Right, right.
But the way they define curriculum seems to be pretty broad. It's not just about the written text itself.
Yeah, and that's what I found interesting, too. It's not just about the words on the page, although obviously that's foundational. What I found really insightful was the emphasis on ensuring that all aspects of the curriculum, like the lesson materials themselves, the learning experiences we create, the activities, even the environment, both physically and relationally where the teaching takes place, it should all consistently reflect biblical principles and unequivocally affirm the Bible's authority. It's a really holistic view of what contributes to the learning journey.
It is. It is. It's like creating this immersive experience.
Right, where every element reinforces the core message.
And lastly, we have the relational function. This one seems particularly significant in a missions context, where you're often navigating different cultural landscapes, right?
Precisely. And that's exactly what the sources highlight. Human relationships are presented as the very foundation of how we interact socially and how we develop our values. And according to the sources, it's God's design for us to live in healthy, thriving relationships, both within our own cultures and across cultures. They emphasize that every Christian has a responsibility to share truth. And the way we teach should cultivate the kind of values that enable learners to really encounter God within the context of those relationships. It's not just about individual faith. It's about shaping values within a community.
It's about building bridges.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that faith flourishes in the context of loving, supportive relationships.
So it seems like establishing this clear philosophical foundation really provides that essential starting point for effective religious education in a missions context. And the sources suggest that it leads to more fruitful strategies for reaching people.
Yeah, it sets the stage for a more intentional and impactful approach.
So now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the practicalities of actually beginning a successful religious education program in a missions setting. Where do we even start?
It's fascinating. What's emphasized right off the bat is the importance of self-knowledge and self-acceptance for those who are planning and implementing these programs. Understanding your own personal history, your personality, your strengths, your weaknesses, that's presented as the absolute first step. And one of the sources even acknowledges that, this isn't always an easy thing for people to grapple with.
It's interesting, right? Because you'd think the immediate focus would be on the people you're trying to reach.
Yeah.
So why this initial emphasis on looking inward?
Well, when you consider some of the potential pitfalls that the sources highlight, it starts to make sense. Missionaries have sometimes, been criticized for not being open to questions from those they're teaching, or for expecting, complete adoption of their own culture, or for exerting a kind of, inappropriate spiritual control over others. So this self-awareness, this willingness to examine your own biases and the cultural baggage you inevitably bring with you, it's essential. You need to know yourself before you can truly understand and effectively engage with another culture.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like taking that inventory, recognizing your own blind spots before you step into someone else's world.
Exactly. It's about humility, really. Recognizing that we all have our own lenses through which we view the world, and those lenses are shaped by our upbringing, our experiences, our culture.
Okay, so after this inward reflection, it seems like the next crucial step is understanding the people you're aiming to teach, their cultural background. And the sources make it pretty clear that just learning the language, while important, isn't enough.
It's just the tip of the iceberg, really. While language is a vital tool for communication, it's only one piece of a much larger and more complex cultural puzzle. And to illustrate this, the sources introduce Edward Hall's work. He identified 10 categories of human activity that go beyond spoken language and are absolutely essential for cross-cultural understanding.
10 categories. Wow, that's quite a lot. So what are some of these categories and how might they impact how we approach religious education in a different culture?
So these categories cover a really broad spectrum of human behavior and interaction. There's things like how different cultures perceive time, which he called temporality, Some cultures are very schedule-oriented, while others are more flexible and event-driven.
Right, right.
Then there's territoriality, which refers to how people understand personal space and boundaries, and association, which deals with how societies are structured and organized. There's also subsistence, which relates to how people obtain food and shelter, their economic systems, and even categories for learning and play, recognizing that different cultures have distinct ways of approaching those activities. And one of the things that Hall pointed out was that these nonverbal aspects of culture, they often have a much deeper and more subconscious influence on how people behave and interact than the words they speak. So understanding these nuances can make a huge difference in how effectively we communicate and teach in a cross-cultural setting.
Could you maybe give us an example of how understanding one of these categories, like you mentioned temporality, how different cultures perceive time? How might that impact how we approach religious education?
Sure. Let's say you're working in a culture where time is viewed as more fluid and less rigidly structured than in a typical Western setting. If you try to implement a religious education program that operates on a very strict, schedule-driven, Western-style model, it might actually create more barriers than bridges. People might feel stressed or disrespected if their cultural norms around time aren't acknowledged. By being sensitive to this difference and adjusting your expectations and the pace of the program, you can create a much more welcoming and conducive learning environment.
That's a great example. It really highlights how important it is to go beyond just the surface level of language and really try to understand the deeper cultural values at play.
Absolutely. It's about meeting people where they are, respecting their cultural norms, and adapting our approach accordingly.
And then building upon that deep cultural understanding, we need to start setting some goals.
Yes, having clearly defined and realistic goals is absolutely essential for effective implementation in a cross-cultural context. These goals should guide the development of programs that genuinely address the spiritual needs of the community and are truly indigenous to the local context, rather than just being imported models from somewhere else.
Right, right.
And the sources mention several specific areas that goals might focus on, such as teaching biblical revelation, foundational doctrines, ethics, church history, and even things like polity, how the local church can be structured and organized in a way that fits within their cultural context.
It's about empowering them to own their faith.
Exactly, to make it their own, not just a carbon copy of something from another culture.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork by understanding the philosophy behind religious education in a missions context and the importance of self-awareness and cultural sensitivity. Now, let's talk about actually being in the teaching situation. The sources seem to really emphasize that it shouldn't just be about lecturing or simply telling people things.
Right, right. There's this strong emphasis on actively involving learners and creating engaging activities, what they call discovered truth. The idea is that when learners actively grapple with the material, when they have to rephrase biblical truths in their own words or work through a problem together, it has a much more profound impact than if they're just passively listening. So the sources advocate for incorporating interesting, relevant activities, diverse activities that really encourage that active participation and discovery. It's not about just filling their heads with information. It's about helping them internalize and own the truth for themselves.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we've talked about the philosophy and some of the practical steps for getting started. Now let's delve into something that seemed to be a recurring theme throughout these sources, this interconnectedness of culture, communication, and contextualization.
Yes, that's really the heart of it all, isn't it? And one of the things that's so important to grasp is that these three elements, culture, communication, and contextualization, they're completely intertwined. You can't effectively communicate or contextualize a message without a deep and nuanced understanding of the culture you're engaging with. They build upon each other.
So let's start with the cultural dimension. The sources point out that educators never enter a cultural vacuum. We all carry our own cultural baggage, so to speak. And they mentioned some historical missionary viewpoints that were actually quite dismissive of non-Christian cultures.
Yeah, it's important to acknowledge that historical context. There was a period where some missionaries operated under this assumption that the existing cultures they encountered, particularly in non-Western settings, were somehow inferior or devoid of any value.
Right.
And that these cultures needed to be essentially replaced with a westernized form of Christianity.
Almost like a cultural imperialism.
Yes, exactly. And the sources are critical of this approach, pointing out that it often created significant barriers to genuine connection and understanding. It imposed a foreign worldview rather than seeking to understand and engage with the existing culture on its own terms.
So if we want to avoid repeating those mistakes, how should religious educators approach these cultural boundaries? What's the right posture to take?
Well, the sources really emphasize the need for humility and a willingness to learn. We need to be acutely aware of these boundaries and recognize that our own cultural background inevitably shapes how we understand and present truth. And this often happens in ways we're not even consciously aware of. If we present the gospel in a way that's inseparable from our own cultural norms and values, the learner might end up rejecting the entire package, the culture, along with the message.
Yeah, they might see it as a foreign religion that has no relevance to their lives.
Exactly. So the key is to make a clear distinction between the core, unchanging truth of the gospel and the cultural packaging it comes wrapped in.
So culture isn't the enemy in this process.
Not at all. In fact, one of the sources quotes Wing Seto, who said that eternal truths and cultural truths are inevitably linked. Culture is the framework through which we understand and apply biblical truth. So the teacher's role becomes one of, first, decontextualizing the message from its original cultural setting, and then working collaboratively with the local community to recontextualize it in a way that makes sense within their own cultural framework.
It sounds like a very delicate and collaborative process, requiring a lot of listening and learning on the part of the teacher.
It absolutely does. It's about building bridges of understanding, not imposing a prepackaged system of beliefs.
What are some of the potential negative consequences if we ignore these cultural boundaries in our teaching?
One of the biggest dangers is creating relational breakdowns. If becoming a disciple is unintentionally perceived as requiring the adoption of a foreign culture, it can lead to a real crisis of identity within the host culture. People might feel like they have to choose between their faith and their cultural heritage, and that can create a lot of tension and division. It also reinforces the idea that Christianity is a foreign religion that doesn't truly belong in their context. And there's often this underlying assumption that what works effectively in one culture will automatically translate to another, which can lead to a lot of frustration and misunderstandings.
It's like assuming that everyone sees the world through the same lens.
Right, and that's just not the case. Every culture has its own unique way of understanding the world, and we need to be sensitive to those differences.
Okay, now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the communication dimension, which is, of course, deeply connected to culture.
Absolutely. One of the sources quotes Dean Barnland, who said that every culture expresses its purposes and conducts its affairs through the medium of communication. So understanding how communication works within a specific cultural context is crucial for effective teaching. And cross-cultural communication is inherently complex. You know, that ideal scenario of message received equals message sent, it rarely happens without a lot of intentional effort.
And the sources even caution that failure in cross-cultural communication goes beyond just simple misunderstandings. It can have some pretty serious consequences.
Exactly. It can lead to frustration, mistrust, even hostility when communication breaks down across cultural lines. So in a missions context, communication needs to be extremely intentional and disciplined to ensure that contextualization can actually occur. We need to be constantly checking in with the learners, seeking feedback, and making sure that the intended message is not only being transmitted, but also accurately received and understood.
So feedback becomes absolutely critical.
Absolutely essential. It's the only way to gauge whether we're truly connecting and communicating effectively.
Now, the sources break down intentional communication into 8 components based on the work of Porter and Samovar. It's quite detailed.
It is. It covers everything from the source of the message and how it's encoded to the channel it travels through, whether it's spoken, written, or nonverbal, to the receiver and how they decode the message, the response, and crucially, the feedback loop.
Right.
But for our purposes, the sources simplify it down to the key elements of teacher, message, learner, and feedback, really emphasizing that this basic process is fundamental and cannot be overlooked.
Okay, so it's a continuous loop where the teacher sends a message, the learner receives and interprets it, and then provides feedback to the teacher, allowing for adjustments and clarification along the way.
Exactly. It's a dynamic and interactive process, not a one-way transmission.
Now let's talk about the third dimension, contextualization itself. How do the sources define this crucial concept?
One of the sources offers this really helpful definition from Bruce Nichols. He says that contextualization is the translation of the unchanging content of the gospel of the kingdom into verbal form meaningful to peoples in their separate cultures and within their particular existential situations. In other words, it's about communicating the eternal truth of the gospel in a way that resonates with people's lived experiences within their specific cultural context.
Right, and Biancato adds to this the idea of making concepts relevant in constantly changing circumstances. So it's about expressing the timeless word in timely ways. It's an ongoing process, adapting to the ever-changing world around us.
Exactly. And that's one of the key distinctions between contextualization and indigenization. Contextualization recognizes that the world is constantly changing and we need to be flexible and adaptable in how we communicate the message, whereas indigenization often focuses more on establishing the church and its practices within a particular culture. But there's a potential danger here that we need to be aware of, and that's syncretism.
Right, syncretism. That's where things can get a bit tricky. The sources describe it as essentially compromising the core truths of the gospel to fit within a particular culture, blending Christian teachings with non-Christian beliefs or practices. And they give a really vivid example, the church in Chichicastenango, Guatemala.
Oh, yes, the church that was built on the site of a former Mayan temple.
And even though it became a Christian church, they continued to practice some traditional Mayan rituals, like burning incense inside the church.
Right. And that's a classic example of syncretism,
Yep.
where cultural practices are adopted without a true understanding or transformation of the underlying beliefs. So the challenge for religious educators, the crucial guiding principle, is finding that balance, presenting the changeless gospel in a changing world while being very careful to avoid syncretism, to ensure that the core message isn't diluted or distorted. The ultimate goal is to foster genuine understanding, to encourage people to think critically about their faith and how it applies to their lives within their own cultural context.
It's about being faithful to the message without being bound by cultural baggage.
Precisely. It's about finding that sweet spot where the gospel can take root and flourish in a new cultural soil without losing its essential identity.
Okay, so now let's move on to the very practical matter of selecting and using teaching methods. How does this connect back to everything we've been discussing about culture, communication, and contextualization?
Well, the way we choose to teach reveals a lot about our underlying philosophy and our understanding of our role as educators. The sources define teaching as, and this is important, guiding individuals to discover and apply biblical truths for themselves. It's not about force-feeding information, it's about facilitating a process of personal discovery.
So the teacher becomes more of a guide or a facilitator than a lecturer.
Exactly. They're creating a space for exploration and discovery, not just delivering a prepackaged set of doctrines. And the sources outline some specific steps to method selection to help guide this process.
What are some of the key principles involved in selecting appropriate teaching methods in a cross-cultural context?
Well, the first step, and this is probably the most important one, is thorough teacher preparation. You can't just assume that materials developed in one cultural context will automatically translate to another. It requires a lot of thought and careful adaptation. And one of the things the sources emphasize is this idea of slow and systematic development of concepts. Don't try to cram too much information into one session. Make sure you're maintaining a clear and consistent focus. And be very explicit about any shifts in focus so people don't get lost. Be mindful of language ambiguities. For example, be careful about using abstract terms or idioms that might not translate well or might be easily misunderstood. And always, always, always strive for relevancy. Make sure you're speaking to issues that genuinely matter to the people you're teaching and that you're using language that's simple, clear, and direct.
It's about meeting them where they are, both intellectually and culturally.
Exactly. Make it accessible, make it relatable, make it meaningful.
And the sources also talk about the importance of using teaching aids strategically.
Yes, teaching aids can be incredibly valuable when they're chosen thoughtfully and adapted to the local culture. And the sources suggest that often the most effective aids are the ones that teachers create themselves because they can be tailored to the specific needs of the learners and the context. And it doesn't have to be anything fancy or high-tech. Even simple tools like newsprint, markers, pictures, objects, they can all be used in creative ways to make the learning more engaging and memorable.
So it's about empowering teachers to be resourceful and creative with whatever materials they have available.
Absolutely. It's about thinking outside the box and finding ways to make the learning come alive.
Now, what about actively involving the learners in the teaching process? How do we move beyond just having them passively listen to a lecture?
Well, this is absolutely central to the whole truth-discovered philosophy. The sources are very clear that learners need to be actively engaged in the learning process beyond just giving verbal responses. So, this requires the teacher to model that active learning and to incorporate activities that encourage them to think critically, to ask questions, to express their own understanding, and to apply what they're learning to their own lives. Things like using illustrations, physical objects, asking open-ended questions that stimulate thought and discussion. These are all great ways to get learners actively involved.
So it's about creating a more interactive and dynamic learning environment.
Exactly. It's about turning the classroom into a space for exploration and discovery, where everyone is participating and contributing.
And the sources provide some additional guidelines for how to enhance this truth-discovered learning approach, right?
Yes, they suggest things like incorporating a variety of teaching methods within a session, specifically designing methods that facilitate discovery rather than just delivering information, considering different learning styles by including at least 3 different types of learning experiences like visual, auditory, and kinesthetic, and maintaining a good pace and momentum to keep people engaged.
So it's about keeping things interesting, varied, and engaging.
Exactly. We want to create a learning experience that's both enjoyable and effective.
Now, one of the methods that's highlighted as particularly valuable in cross-cultural settings is the chronological storying method. Why is storytelling considered such an effective approach?
Well, stories have this amazing power to transcend cultural and linguistic barriers. They tap into something universal within us, and they're often perceived as less confrontational or threatening than direct doctrinal teaching. So, using stories to communicate biblical truth can be a very effective way to engage people from different backgrounds and belief systems.
The sources go into quite a bit of detail about how to implement chronological Bible storying, covering everything from initial teacher planning to the actual storytelling process itself. It seems like a very intentional and structured approach.
It is. It involves a lot of careful preparation, thinking about the specific needs of the learners, creating a sense of anticipation and interest at the beginning of the session, reading directly from scripture, telling the story in a narrative style that captures people's attention, using questions strategically to guide discovery and encourage reflection, and then allowing space for discussion and fellowship.
Right.
And one of the key elements of this method is encouraging learners to retell the story in their own words. This helps them to internalize the message and make it their own.
So it's not just about passively listening to the teacher. It's about actively engaging with the story and making it personally meaningful.
Exactly. And it's important to note that storying encompasses a much broader range of activities than just questioning and retelling. It can include things like writing, role-playing, drama, even using different forms of art to express the story.
So it's a very versatile and adaptable method.
It really is. And one of the things I appreciate about it is that it recognizes the power of story to connect with people on a deep emotional level, which can be incredibly impactful, especially in cross-cultural settings.
Now, to really bring all of these principles to life and show how they can be applied in a real-world setting, the sources provide some specific examples of teaching plans from South Korea.
Yes, these examples provide a great illustration of how this truth-discovered enabling equipping approach can be implemented in a specific mission context.
Let's start with the teaching model for youth, using Romans 3.23 and the Steps to Peace with God tract. The teaching aim is for the learners to be able to explain what's required for salvation. What are some of the key activities in this plan?
This particular model incorporates several different learning activities. It includes verse memorization, helping students develop those Bible navigation skills to find the verse, using a visual diagram from the tract to illustrate the concepts of sin and separation from God, and then guiding the students through a series of questions to apply those concepts to their own lives. There's also a component where the teacher shares their personal testimony about how they came to understand and experience salvation, which can be really powerful. And then the students are given the opportunity to practice explaining the diagram and the concept of salvation to a partner, which helps to solidify their understanding.
So it incorporates a variety of learning styles and activities to cater to different learners.
Exactly. It's about being creative and finding ways to make the learning stick.
And one of the things the sources point out is that this model was specifically designed to address the cultural context in South Korea, where many young people lack basic biblical knowledge but have strong rote memory skills. So it leverages their strengths while also pushing them towards a deeper level of analysis and personal application.
It's a great example of how understanding the cultural context can inform the design of your teaching methods.
Now let's look at the teaching model for children. This one uses the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 from Mark 7, and the teaching aim is to help them understand God's love and care. What's the approach here?
This plan utilizes pictures to aid in storytelling, with the teacher asking questions throughout to make sure the children are understanding and following along. It also includes a verse memorization component using 1 Peter 5.7, which talks about casting all your anxieties on God because he cares for you. And then there's a really beautiful part where the teacher shares a personal example of how they experienced God's provision in their own life, which makes the concept more tangible and relatable for the children.
Right.
And then the children are asked to draw pictures of what God has provided for them, which is a great way for them to express their understanding and make it personal. They also sing songs related to God's care, and the session ends with prayer.
So it's a very multisensory and interactive approach.
It is. It's designed to engage their imaginations and help them experience the truth of God's love and care in a tangible way. And again, this plan was designed with specific cultural considerations in mind. The sources point out that Korean children tend to have excellent memories and are generally well-behaved in a classroom setting, but they sometimes need a little encouragement to express themselves verbally. So this plan incorporates activities that allow them to express their understanding through drawing and singing, as well as through discussion.
And finally, let's talk about the teaching model for adults. This one uses the encounter between Jesus and the Samaritan woman in John 4. And the aim is for learners to not only understand the story, but also to relate Jesus' teachings to their own lives.
This plan starts by providing some historical and cultural context about the relationship between Jews and Samaritans, which helps the learners to understand the significance of this encounter. Then, the passage is read aloud, and a series of discussion questions are used to guide the learners towards both comprehension and application. For example, they might discuss why Jesus would choose to ask a Samaritan woman for water, what he meant by living water, and how they can personally experience this living water in their own lives. Then they're challenged to think about how they can share this living water with others, how they can share their faith in their own context.
And the plan suggests using a chalkboard to write down the group's ideas and responses.
Yes, and that's a really intentional choice. The sources point out that Korean adults are very familiar with a lecture-style format, so the plan starts there, but then gradually shifts to a more interactive discussion format, which encourages them to think more critically and apply what they're learning to their own lives.
So it's about finding that balance between respecting cultural norms and encouraging deeper engagement.
Exactly. It's about meeting people where they are and gently guiding them towards a more interactive and transformative learning experience.
These examples are so helpful in demonstrating how all of these principles can be put into practice in very specific contexts. It's one thing to talk about abstract concepts like contextualization and learner engagement, but it's another thing entirely to see how those principles can be embodied in actual teaching plans.
I agree. These examples really bring the theory to life and provide a concrete framework for how to approach religious education in a thoughtful and culturally sensitive way.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what would you say is the most critical takeaway for our listeners? What's the one thing you hope they'll remember?
Throughout all of these sources, there's this consistent emphasis on the teacher as exemplar. It's this idea that effective teaching in a missions context isn't just about the information we convey, it's profoundly influenced by who we are as teachers. Our character, our attitudes, our actions, they all speak volumes. Preparation and enthusiasm are definitely contagious, but the sources are clear that our actions must align with the message we're teaching for true learning and transformation to occur.
It all comes back to that powerful statement, doesn't it? The teacher must know the message, but more than that, the teacher must be the message.
Yes, that really encapsulates it. It highlights the holistic nature of this endeavor. It's not just about imparting knowledge, it's about embodying the very truth we're sharing.
Well said. So we've taken a pretty deep dive into this topic of religious education within the context of mission work. We've explored the philosophical underpinnings, practical strategies for initiating programs, the crucial roles of culture, communication, and contextualization, and some very effective teaching methodologies. We've even looked at some real-world examples of how these principles can be put into practice. And I think it's safe to say that effectively equipping new believers is